And then we have the icky sex magic. That is probably a low light for me. The fact that he's like, no, I need to regenerate my magic by having sex with someone. We really could have not. Like, we could have chosen anything else. Hi, hello, how are you? Welcome back to my channel. I hope you're doing well because I know that I am. Why? Because today we're doing something really exciting. I just finished reading A Court of Thorns and Roses, which has been very popular on BookTube for a while, but now with Book Talk has reached even new levels of hype. Because everyone and their mom is like, this is the best book ever. If you like romance, if you like fantasy, if you want to fall in love with reading again, read this book. I sat on my Sarah J. Maas high horse for a while. I was like, no, I'm not gonna read that because it's trash. Then I found it at the bargain bin at a thrift store and I was like, you know what? I'll give it a go. And so I did. I read it this past week and I tabbed all of my thoughts and I've written them down and I'm gonna come at you with my full review of this book. Now, I just want to say I have absolutely no hate towards Sarah J. Maas. I have no hate towards people who absolutely love this book. If you like this, that's great for you. I'm so happy that you enjoyed reading something. This just like was not for me, and that's okay. So I'm going to structure this in 4 parts. So first I'm going to talk about the writing and that'll be spoiler free. And then we'll jump into the spoilers with discussions of the plot, world building, and then most importantly, the romance. And then I have some like general gripes to throw in at the end. But without further ado, let's get started.
Yeah, get into it.
So the writing of this book, I didn't expect it to be like great English literature, but there were a couple things in here that just So first, you're like thrown into this fantasy world. There's this girl stalking through a forest, and guess what? She's literally Katniss.
The flavor, oh my god, it's so real. Like,
she's just another one of those I'm not like other girl pick-me girls who's stalking through a forest hunting to provide for her family. Not my favorite choice, gonna be perfectly honest. And then we find out that her name is Feyre. Like, noting that this is a book about fairies and like the Fae as they're called, the fact that her name is Feyre is just beyond me how she came up with the amazing creativity that it took to coin that name.
I am so powerful. My mind, oh, it amazes me sometimes.
And then in this book, they call like rich people in the mortal world aristos. Don't know how you feel about that, but that makes me feel super uncomfy. Then this pick-me girl basically does something wrong, hence the inciting incident, and then, you know, kind of has to deal with the consequences of being like a shit person. And she's like, can you blame me? This attitude that this girl has is out of this world. She could have been classy and interesting and like had a point of view without just going, can you blame me? And then we have the typical, I'm not like other girls, I'm not gonna wear dresses scene where I'm like, do we really need to do this? Do we really need her to get in a fight with her lady's maid about how she wants to wear trousers and not a dress? Like, is this necessary? I think no. And then one of the particular abilities of this group of fairies is that they can shapeshift into wolves. It sounds kind of cool, but this like furry fantasy becomes so comedic when you realize that the way that she's designed these wolves is that they have Wolverine claws that shoot out of their hands, and like you can, like their skin is transparent and you can see the claws underneath. Like, that's such a gross image. I don't know, every time it was like he couldn't keep his temper in and it's like I could see his claws like fighting to come out of his hand. I'm like, that's a gross image and I'm uncomfortable. Another weird image is she goes on this adventure at one point and she like grabs a hunk of cheese as a snack. Why are all these pick-me girls taking hunks of cheese? It's such a dumb snack. If you're walking around, it's gonna melt in your pocket and get sticky. It also needs to be refrigerated. I'm always confused about why a hunk of cheese is like the perfect adventure snack in these books. There's also an image of like her at a party, and like in this magical world, up until this point, food always magically appears. Like, it just appears out of nowhere and then you like grab whatever's on the table. But at this specific event, she has to stand in line at a buffet alone, and I just think that's such a funny image of her being like, I'm gonna go get my food now. It's just like the kind of thing that's so out of place where I'm like, you had this whole system built up of how food is served in your world, and then you just said, no, she's going to stand in line at a buffet. You have the, I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding, obviously. And then she also says her bones bark in pain. That doesn't really make any sense. But my favorite sentence that is used not once, not twice, but 3 times in this book is, my bowels turned watery.
We are going to pretend we didn't hear that.
I didn't need to know how your, you know, situation was doing down there. You know, like if you want to say you were nervous, like there are other ways to convey that you were like nervous or feeling uncomfy than telling us that you wanted to have diarrhea. Like, ooh, hot take. I could just go into all of the weird writing moments, but like that's kind of the whole book. So we're gonna move on into the spoilers of it all. My first problem is that there's a literal spoiler in the dedication of the book. It says, for Josh, because you would go under the mountain for me. I love you. Great, so we know that she's gonna go under the mountain to save her beloved. Like, awesome. Way to let me know exactly what the whole plot of your book is before I even started reading. So Feyre goes into the woods and she like shoots this like wolf who she knows is a fairy, whatever. And she like skins the wolf and then wraps the doe that she shot in the wolf's clothing, which I think is like such a weird metaphor where it's like, you're going to see things that are aggressive on the outside, but if you peel back that layer, like they're really nice. There's like immediately like a plot hole with this whole poverty timeline, which still doesn't make sense to me. I just can't get this straight. And neither can she, because literally she's talking about how like their home was ransacked by their creditors. And then literally 2 pages later, she's like, oh yeah, our mom's fancy silverware that had sold a long time ago. Did you not just tell me that your belongings had been ransacked? Like, get your story straight. If you're going to have this traumatic backstory, at least put in some effort to make it convincing. And then you have like the weird abduction tone shift when Tamlin comes in, it's like, and then it's like, no, but I'll spare you, because like, you know, like vibes. I didn't know that this was a Beauty and the Beast retelling, but like, you know, seeing that, I was like, oh, okay, awesome. So like, he's been cursed and needs her to break this curse. He's gonna go like live in his castle and fall in love with him. The tone shift made it so clear that something was up. I'm like, this could have been executed better. This whole charade was like so bizarre. You're like, okay, so Feyre has this like tragic backstory of like having been rich and then she was like poor, whatever. So what else is she gonna do to be interesting? She's like, oh, I paint? I'm an art hoe. Basically what that means is that she like doodled around her house like Rapunzel from Tangled. And then every time she sees something interesting, she's like, I want to paint that, but I would never be able to do it justice because I'm just like a lowly human, which doesn't give her dimension at all. Her just like wanting to paint is just not interesting. That's not an interesting hobby that tells me anything about her other than she's like also sensitive. Like she's a hunter, but like she actually just wants to paint. And she always talks about how in her ideal future, all she wants is have enough money so she can paint. That's so shallow. Your whole personality cannot be, I just want to paint. There has to be a little bit more to you than that. But no, that's all we get, is that she like kind of likes to draw. Phenomenal. Then we get like a huge spoiler again. We're talking about the Blight on page 73. And it becomes very clear that the Blight is being personified in a way that makes it very clear that it is a person. The Blight is cruel like that. Yeah, because it's clearly a person. This idea that there's like this reveal that the Blight is Amathera or whatever her name is at the end, little clues like this made it so that on the one hand, like it could have been like a satisfying reveal because it's like, oh, like it was set up well. But at the same time, I was able to guess it on page 73 that there's like a person doing this because they're magical people. So if there's magic, it's probably coming from a person, especially if you describe the magic as coming from a person. So this made me angry. Like that's the cornerstone of the plot, is that there's this Blight and you gave away like your whole twist on page 73. And then you have some more horrible foreshadowing where she's like, with that thought, I went back to my little table. At least I'd know the layout of their lands and I knew to never, ever go north. Well, great. Because of your I'm not like other girl stubbornness, we know that the first opportunity you get, you're gonna be running up north. So thanks for once again spoiling. And then we have Lucien absolutely carrying the plot. Feyre goes up to him to try to convince him to make Tamlin let her go. And he absolutely calls her out on her shit and is sassy and interesting, bites back, and like he's the only person with an actual personality. And I'm like, yes, this is what I came here to see. He's hyper confident, hyper confident, and interesting to read about. And like every time he's on the page, it's exciting because you know that there's going to be like some kind of like tension. He's the kind of character that I want to be following. Thank you for carrying the plot. And then we have more Lucien being interesting when he's like, oh, you want to like go hunt this crazy fairy that's probably gonna kill you? Go ahead. He gives her like all of the information she needs and, you know, is helpful. Is he stirring the pot a little bit? Yeah, but like he's moving the plot forward, which no one else in this book apparently has any interest in doing. So I'm like, you know what? Thank you. Thank you. I think this was an honorable act, at least for me. She was looking out for me as the reader because I was getting bored. Then Feyre comes back from, you know, hunting the truth fairy and is like, I should wallop you for not having prepared me. He literally did prepare you though. He told you exactly how to catch it and how to run away from it. And the fairy that he taught you how to catch didn't do anything bad to you. It was the other fairies that he didn't prepare you for. because he didn't know that they would be there. But like, he very literally well prepared you for the fairy that you wanted to catch. So this whole like, how could you not have told me? Like, I'm not interested. And then we get Lucian's backstory, which is like intriguing because some like really grim stuff has happened to him. And I'm like, great, confirmed. He is the most interesting character. I've heard people describe him as a wet blanket, and I'm like, why? Up until this point, I'm like, no, he's carrying the plot. He's the most interesting person. He has an interesting backstory. And like, when he's on the page, he drives the plot forward. So like, I'm 100% Team Lucian at this point. You compare him to the other characters like Feyre, who like made plans with Tamlin to be shown the art gallery. And then the day of, like the beginning of that chapter, she's like, I was surprised when he took me to a wing of the house I'd never been to before. You made these plans with him. Like, of course you've never been to that wing, because he told you you've never been there and you knew you'd never been there. That's why you're going. Like, I don't understand how you're surprised about this. Like, the computing power in her is just really tragic. And then, you know, she goes and pulls her I'm not like other girls stunt where all of the people are like, please stay in your room. And she's like, you know what? You know what I will do? Because I'm edgy and cool, is I will not stay in my room. And so obviously she sneaks out. And it's just like so irritating because she's like, no, it's the music's fault because it was like pulling me by my heart. Like I had to follow the drums. Like, no, you were following your like dumb little brain that was telling you that you needed to re-inject yourself into the story because Tamlin might forget you if he didn't see you for 30 seconds. Like, come on. And then we have the icky sex magic. That is probably a low light for me. The fact that he's like, no, I need to like regenerate my magic by like having sex with someone. We really could have not. Like, we could have chosen anything else. Like, you know, why couldn't it have been like dancing around a bonfire with someone else? No, instead he has to sleep with someone else.
Definitely
That's
no for me, dog.
And then, now that there's like some semblance of sexual tension between Feyre and Tamlin, Lucian just starts acting completely out of character, and anytime anything interesting is gonna happen, instead of staying there and commenting on it like he would have in the first 50 pages and being interesting, he just gets up and leaves. He's like, oh, all right, I see that you guys want some private time now, and then walks away. Which, you know, makes sense because that's like a nice thing to do, but it's not within his character. Like, you set him up as this devilish, fox-like character who goes in and like gets up to mischief. He would be staying there and making things interesting and making them uncomfortable and like stirring the pot. Like, there's no reason for you to give up on all of this character development that you could have had. She could have gone in such an interesting direction with Lucian, but like, no. He just like starts to be like, oh, okay, I'll give you your privacy now.
But you did this for what?
Whatever. And then you have a couple weird time skips where like they'll make plans for the next day and then they won't do them until apparently 2 months later. But then within those 2 months, their romantic relationship didn't evolve at all. And like nothing else happens except for the fact that it's like been 2 months and they're doing the plans that they made that would make sense for them to do the next day. It just feels like she injected, 2 months later in there. There's really only enough plot in here for them to have been together for like 2 to 3 weeks. But she adds these like weird time jumps in so that it sounds like they've been like in love for longer so that their romance is believable at the end. Then Feyre goes home and the whole home sequence is really boring. I had literally nothing to say because I was just like, when is she gonna go back? Like, she's obviously gonna go back. The book could have been 50 pages shorter if she just gone back and been like, no, this is wrong. Really didn't need that much time. And then like the inciting incident for her to like go back up to Prythian and like save her friends is because her sister Nesta is like, this is what was wrong with our dad. He never fought for our mom. Like, when she got sick, he didn't look for a cure absolutely everywhere. And so like, that's why our dad is a piece of garbage and you need to be better than him. And to this I say, does the mom not have any agency? We have no insight into how this death actually went down because the author doesn't take us there. We're just supposed to believe that the mom like was laying down and like suffering and the dad was like, I'm sick, and then like walked away. Are we just gonna pretend that the mother has like no say in this? Like, there's also a pretty good chance that she would have been like, no, save the fortune, don't spend the money on me. That's something that I could foresee as being like pretty reasonable, is the mother being like, don't waste all of your money on me, take care of the kid. The fact that that's not even addressed as a possibility, it's just like, no, the dad sucks, so don't be like him. Don't think about any of the consequences of your actions. Just do the thing that sounds honorable, because if you don't, you'll be like our dad, who we never asked about this series of events, but we're going to assume that he sucks. And then like, while she's leaving, she's like, Nesta, at any sign of trouble, you guys have to get out. As if like the fire of like the innocent people was not enough of a sign that things were amiss. I just don't understand why she wouldn't just tell them, leave immediately, except to build tension later on in the plot when she's like, I hope that they made it out okay. Like, doesn't make any sense. Like, the logic in this girl is just so far beyond me. And so she goes back up and she finds out about this whole curse. And I'm like, this is a really specific curse. Like, the most magical thing that happens in this book is that Tamlin remembered the entirety of this curse because it's so convoluted. I just can't believe. Anyway, so she gets under the mountain. And this queen, who's literally just like an old guy caricature, who's like, I'm evil, like, whatever, and is given this riddle. It's like, oh, well, if you solve my riddle, then like, I'll let everyone go immediately. You're like, oh man, this is gonna be a tough one. And I read the riddle and I was like, oh, so love? Yeah, just love. Just love. Which, like, at the time when I thought of it, I was like, you know what, that does kind of make sense. Like, it is kind of ironic. I think that there was potential for this to be like a pretty good answer to the riddle because Feyre's supposed to be there fighting for love, and the irony of her not being able to solve this riddle because she's such a dumb human, like, I think that is an angle that could have been really interestingly explored, because it's like, you think that you love, but you clearly don't even understand what love is, because like when you're faced with what it feels like in this higher elevated form, in the form of poetry, you don't have the capacity to understand it. So the fact that you're fighting here is totally moot. You're wasting your time. That irony could have been really well explored, but the riddle isn't that hard to solve. Like, she doesn't have to be so exceptionally smart like me and solve it in 30 seconds, you know, but like the fact that it took her, what, however many months she was trapped in a cell alone with nothing but time to think, and she couldn't solve this, like, that's kind of a huge bummer.
I am under the water. Please help me. Here too much raining.
And so then, you know, she goes into her first task, which is dumb, but you know, at least she's able to like show off her skills. And I'm like, look, if we're going to have a magical contest, it's good that she's able to show off her skills. And she's in a labyrinth, which is quite a cliche, but at least she has her own original spin on it, and she's being like an interesting heroine. Cool. And then she's like hurt, and so Rice, the other guy, heals her, and you know, she makes this Persephone deal, which is just like unnecessary. This is like weird emotional manipulation, because he's like, yeah, like I did it so that Tamlin would get even angrier to kill Amthera, and I'm like, no, like I'm pretty sure he was pissed enough. I don't think you needed to objectify Feyre to make him mad. Like, I'm pretty sure he was already pissed by like being basically enslaved. So kind of not the best justification, but alas. And then you see, like, they're supposed to be having this like intimate moment between Feyre and Rhys. He shows his wings, and I just can't stop imagining the pterodactyl ghost from the Scooby-Doo movie. And then like Rhys starts drugging her and like making Feyre dance for him, which is just another level of uncomfortable, where I'm like, this once again was not necessary. Like, you don't need to objectify her and insinuate that you're raping her to like make Tamlin angry. This is just unnecessary and super uncomfortable. I don't know, like the bar is pretty low for how to be not a piece of garbage in this world. All you have to do is not assault her, and yet he does. And like, I guess there is like the redeeming quality that he's literally the reason that she survives the second task, but like justification of insinuating assault and like making her do things under the influence, not the greatest. When Feyre was preparing to go under the mountain, Alice was like, don't trust your senses and listen really well. So I'm like, okay, great, well, that doesn't make sense. Either she's supposed to listen or not trust her senses. There were like multiple moments where I was like, this would be an incredible time for something to appear not as it is. When Tamlin is kissing her in the dark at the party, that would be a great opportunity for her to have been tricked. But no, it's just Tamlin in the silence, not even saying like, oh, I missed you, whatever. We'll get into it in the romance part. But then like for her to be like, oh, I remember these like conversations that I eavesdropped on because like they were clearly meant for me, and then makes this huge leap, this huge logical leap that she has no background for being able to make, because as we've previously seen, her logic is dog shit. She's like, you know what? He has a heart of stone, so I'm gonna stab Tamlin. Which just, oh, it's so stupid. And then she like ends up dying anyway. And then she's like, oh, the answer to the riddle is love. I'm glad she got there eventually, but like, what inconvenient timing. And then she's like brought to life and becomes a fairy. Whatever. End of story. She runs off into the like spring court with Tamlin and everything's fine. That's the plot. Some pretty big holes. I'd say that this plot is like medium successful. Like it's interesting. Like there are some cliffhangers and it's well structured enough that you want to keep reading. Like it's paced pretty poorly in the first half, but the second half is paced well enough that you're like, okay, I can get down with this like magical test plot, breaking a curse. Like there are some things that are enticing about it. But in order to explore those things that are enticing, I made a note of all of the references to other fantasy. So like how this has been inspired by the genre. So Lord of the Rings, we have the fact that it's under the mountain. I'm like, that's very Hobbit of you. And then also the description of the throne room under the mountain is like, oh, there are these huge ancient doors, a cavern that's held up by like hundreds of these pillars. I'm like, oh, so the Mines of Moria. So literally this room that we all saw in the films, this one right here, fantastic. Then you have the things taken from the Wheel of Time, which I feel very passionately about because I love the Wheel of Time, and some of these things are just like sacrilegious because they're done really well in the Wheel of Time, and then you see it here and you're like, this is it? This is what you thought. Interesting. You have these like children of the immortal light. I'm like, oh, so 100% White Cloak vibes. And then like the mercenary tells Feyre about like this horrible fairy that she battled that had either like a wolf face or like eagle face. I'm like, oh, so a Trolloc. So a literal Trolloc is what you were fighting. That's awesome. And then the Bogga is like, you can't believe that it's real because that's when it's able to hurt you. I'm like, oh, okay, so everything in Teleron real. That's awesome. And then you have the Cauldron, which is a weak impersonation of the pattern. Where it's like, oh, I wonder what the eddies of the cauldron have in store for me. You mean the threads of the pattern. That's what you were trying to say, and you said it poorly. And then lastly, you have like the fairy that answers questions for Feyre. I'm like, awesome. So the Taron Grail that answered questions for Rand, Mat, and Moiraine. And then the message that like she has to stay with the High Lord and she'll be safe. So I'm like, oh, awesome. So Mat going to Rhuidean. Like same exact thing, same vibe, done worse. Then Game of Thrones, like the map, it's literally Westeros backwards. So you have a wall separating the like creepy magical people from the normal people, except it's been moved way south. Awesome. And then like the end of the first chapter is her like dragging this corpse back, and she was like, but everything has to be okay because it was winter. I'm like, that's a weird spin-off of Winter is Coming that I'm like not super excited about. Then the worm from the first trial is literally one of the worms taken from Dune. The description of the body, the way that the teeth are, like everything down to the T about how this worm behaves, besides the fact that it lives in mud as opposed to sand, is taken directly from Dune, which is another huge bummer. So like obviously, like as is really common in fantasy, it's built upon the tropes and the established like norms of the genre, and so it's understandable that a lot of stuff is taken. But when the back of your book says that Sarah J Maas is a master of fantasy and that there's a dazzling world, I'm expecting something more than some like kind of sloppily repackaged fantasy worlds from like other better books. This is really clear in the language system, where like the different kinds of fairies are like the Bogga, Naga, and Martax. What language system is that supposed to be coming from? Like there has to be some kind of unifying factor that makes it feel cohesive, but no, it's like she just got like a random letter generator and she was like, yeah, that sounds like a good monster name. None of this sounds like it comes from the same language. None of it sounds cohesive. And like, I don't want to be like those Tolkien fans who are like, it's not real fantasy unless you have a full language so that you can speak fluent. How many languages do your trees speak? You know, like I don't want to be like that. So like I don't expect her to have a whole syntax for like the old Fae, high Fae language, but making everything sound cohesive and like it's part of the same universe would be kind of nice. And then I have some questions about this world. We're introduced to the day, night, and dawn courts, and I'm like, wait, so do they have seasons then? Like, what are their seasons? Like, it's just like, it's always dawn? Like, so the sun doesn't move there, but like, do you get seasons then? Is it just like always cold in the night court? Or do you have like winter nights and summer nights? I would like to know, because it's not like you don't have nights in the spring court. So they must have seasons. I don't know. Like, I think that that's like a valid point that I would want to have explained. Then, like, when they go to this glen, Feyre and Tamlin, and he's like, come swim in this pool of starlight with me. First of all, the fact that there's no swimsuits in this world is like kind of concerning. I'm like, I feel like that's something that could have been remedied. Like they didn't need to be skinny dipping. It's kind of a big first step. None of that. He's just already naked and he's like, all right, join me. Like, I don't know, that feels a little weird and pressury. So not super hot on that. And then on page 201, she's like, Feyre's walking around. She's like, oh, they must have heard me or smelled me or used one of their other heightened senses. I'm like, which one? Did they taste you from far away? Like, what other sense would they have used? Baffled is what I was. And then for the romance, I feel many ways about this romance. Mostly negative. Because first, I will never not be uncomfortable with the age difference in books like this. Like, she's 19. I thought she was 15 for most of the book because the time skips were so poorly explained. I thought she was 15 until she explicitly said that she was 19. But regardless, he's like literally 1,000 years old. And the fact that he's like, oh yeah, I've had so many sexual partners and I'm so old and I've loved so many people. And he's like a grown-ass adult and she's 19. That dynamic is just so uncomfortable. Then, like, the fact that this is just really like a thinly veiled furry fantasy really makes me uncomfy. The constant mention of his claws and like his beast form and the verbiage that's used to describe that, when it's like, oh, he was prowling, and then like when they're having like a steamy scene saying that he like roared over the edge with her. Not for me. Not for me.
Call the police.
None of this like borderline bestiality. And then like the only thing that Tamlin and Feyre have in common, the only time that they have like a bonding moment is where they're like, oh, I'm like responsible for like other people. Feyre like hunted for her family and Tamlin's in charge of the Spring Court because he's the High Lord, and they're like, you also know what it's like to have responsibility. I'm like, that's not enough of a foundation for a relationship. You're like, oh, I would do absolutely anything for this person. This person is my soulmate. What do you have in common? We both have to do things. Like, that's not really, it really can't be enough. There are multiple times where like they get in an argument and then it's like the author remembered that like, oh no, they're supposed to be in love now. And so like the next page, Feyre will just forget all of the shitty things that he did to her. She'll be like, oh, he's so great. And then also there's this weird fetishization that Tamlin does of Feyre in her mortal form, where he's like, oh, because your human joy fascinates me. The way you experience things in your lifespan so wildly and deeply, I'm drawn to it, even when I know I shouldn't be, even when I try not to be. He's not in love with you. He's in love with the idea of you being human. He's fetishizing you and using you to like fulfill this sick need that he has to feel close to humans because he's intrigued by the idea of them. Like, that's really creepy. Like, that's sucks. And then you meet Rhys and you're like, oh, he's obviously going to be the other love interest. He's interesting. And then during all of the trials, Rhys is the only one that's like actually ever there for her and is helping her. I mean, besides Lucien like helping her in the first trial and like healing her after her nose was broken, like Tamlin doesn't do shit. But Rhys is there for her. And like, he doesn't have the best justification for his actions, but at least he's doing things. At least he's taking agency. He's much more interesting and he's much more flawed. And like, we see him doing morally ambiguous things and working through the consequences of his actions instead of just being like neutral, which Tamlin is. Like, he's so boring. He doesn't do anything. And Feyre is just like, you're hot though. And like, when Feyre finds out that Tamlin had been using her to like break this curse and had emotionally manipulated her by setting up the scenario for her to kill someone and then taking her on a guilt trip about it, even though he'd orchestrated the whole thing, and then kept her prisoner and lied to her about why he was doing it, also that like he could be free. She's like, yeah, no problem. Sounds good. Sounds reasonable. Like, she has absolutely no problem and doesn't make him face any of the consequences for the fact that their entire relationship was built on a monumental lie. But that doesn't matter. Of course not.
You done lost your damn mind. When you get your damn mind, you call me.
And like, the fact that the curse is also like so infantile, it's like, well, you have to say I love you out loud or else they're like not really in love with you. I'm like, that's so Chuck and Blair season 2 of Gossip Girl, where they're like, 3 words, 8 letters, say it and I'm yours. Like, that's so dumb. That's not how love works. The last like thing that made me uncomfy is the way that Rhys's voice at one point is described as an erotic caress. No, ma'am. No, ma'am. At the end of the book, I was like, oh, I'm Team Rhys. Like, because he's interesting and he like fought for her and was interesting instead of just being like, no, I'll protect you and suffer alone, which is like Tamlin's whole thing. I was like, no, Rhys is interesting and compelling and he's doing interesting and compelling things, even though they're morally gray. Like, you know, there's a spectrum between the black and white of things, and it's okay if you're on the blacker end of the gray part, you know? Like, that's okay, but like, lean into it. And Rhys is doing that. So I'm like, you know what? He's kind of interesting. I wanted her to end up with him. I wanted her to be like, actually, Tamlin, you kind of suck. But alas, waiting for book 2 for that to happen, hopefully. And then my general gripes with this, the blurbs that absolutely hyped it up to be something that it definitely is not. The cover, which shows the wolf being shot in the neck, when in fact, I know because I have critical reading skills that he was shot in the side. Like very clearly shot in the side and then shot through the eye. So like, that's not the side, that's the neck. So, and then the fact that the font inside the books for the numbers is like the Harry Potter font is just like infinitely entertaining to me. There were a couple good moments. Like there was one moment that pulled on my heartstrings on page 153 where they're talking about like not wanting to die alone, where I was like, wow, this is actually like pretty well written. But the entire time while I was going through my notes, that's the only good moment I could find. So in conclusion, is this book good? No. Do I think you should read it? Maybe. If you're just looking for like kind of like a low-key fun time and you're not looking to think very critically about what you're reading, this is it for you. I understand why people recommend it because it is like a fun romp. Like once you get through the boring first 50 pages, like the second end is paced well and it's entertaining. So like, yeah, makes sense. But if you are like an actual fantasy reader, this is not even close to the same level of other adult high fantasy. It's kind of a joke how shallow this feels in comparison. From that perspective, like no. But it depends on what you're looking for, because if you're just looking for a lighthearted romance with like some like light magic vibes, then this is it for you. With that, thank you so much for joining me. I hope you enjoyed this video. As always, I had a wonderful time hanging out with you. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. It really helps the channel out. And with that, I am looking forward to seeing you guys next time.